Look at your hands right now. Open and close your fingers. Feel how easily they move, how effortlessly they bend. Now imagine those hands belonging to a 7-year-old child. And imagine those hands never stopping 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, in the dark, in the noise, in the heat and the dust and the danger. That was childhood for millions of children in Victorian Britain. And tonight, we're going to find out what it was actually like. In 1830, roughly half the workforce in British factories were children, not teenagers' children. Some as young as 4 years old, they worked the same brutal hours as adults and earned a fraction of the pay. They faced punishments that would be unthinkable today. And here is what makes this truly difficult to comprehend. This was normal. This was expected. This was how the greatest industrial power on earth built its wealth. If you are using this to fall asleep tonight, these stories have waited almost 200 years. They'll still be here in the morning. Subscribe and stick around to understand how millions of children ended up inside factories. You have to understand what happened to Britain in the late 1700s. The Industrial Revolution didn't arrive gently. It tore apart the way people had lived for centuries and replaced it with something entirely new. Before the factories, most families worked together at home. Spinning and weaving happened in cottages. Children helped their parents with simple tasks. The work was hard, certainly, but it happened within the family. Parents controlled the pace. Children learned trades from their mothers and fathers. There was rhythm to it. Seasons mattered. Daylight mattered. The human body still set the limits of what could be done in a day. Then came the machines. Richard Arkwright's water frame, James Hargreaves' spinning jenny, Edmund Cartwright's power loom. These inventions could produce cloth faster than any human hand, but they needed buildings to house them. They needed power to run them, and they needed workers small enough to fit between them. Workers who could crawl into the gaps where adult hands couldn't reach. Workers who could be paid almost nothing. The new textile mills that sprang up across Lancashire, Yorkshire, and the Midlands were enormous by the standards of the time. Some stretched hundreds of feet long. Inside, the noise was deafening. The spinning mules clanked and roared. The air was thick with cotton dust that coated everything and everyone in a fine white film. You could taste it, you could feel it in your lungs, and after 12 hours it was all you could smell. The temperature inside these rooms was kept deliberately high, sometimes reaching 90 degrees or more, because warm air made the cotton easier to spin. Children worked their shifts in this stifling heat, breathing air so thick with fiber particles that many developed chronic lung disease before they turned 12. There was no ventilation to speak of. Opening windows was forbidden because drafts could break the delicate cotton threads. So the children breathed recycled air laden with cotton dust, machine oil fumes, and coal smoke from the engines that powered everything. Upper respiratory disease was so common among factory children. It was simply considered part of the job. And here is the thing that might be hardest to understand from our perspective. Factory owners didn't see anything wrong with hiring children. Neither did most of society. In 1700s Britain, a child who wasn't working was considered idle. Idleness was a sin. Even religious leaders endorsed putting children to work as young as possible. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, actively recommended child labor as a way of preventing youthful idleness and vice. Daniel Defoe thought it admirable that in towns near Halifax, hardly anyone over the age of 4 was unemployed. This wasn't cruelty as they understood it. This was moral duty. But what actually happened inside those factory walls was something else entirely. The youngest children in cotton mills were given 2 jobs, scavengers and piecers. If you had to pick the worst occupations in the history of labor, these would be near the top of the list. Scavengers were the very youngest workers, sometimes as young as 4. Their job was to crawl beneath the spinning mules, while the machines were still running, and sweep up the loose cotton that fell to the floor. Cotton was valuable. Factory owners couldn't afford to waste any of it, so they sent tiny children underneath moving machinery to collect every last scrap. The machines never stopped. The owners wouldn't allow it. Every minute of stillness cost them money. Think about that for a moment. A machine weighing several tons, moving back and forth on iron rails, metal parts spinning and clanking inches above your head, and you are 4 years old, lying flat on a filthy floor, trying to sweep cotton scraps while timing your movements to avoid being crushed. David Rowland, who worked as a scavenger in Manchester, later testified before Parliament. He described how he frequently had to lie completely flat to avoid being caught by the machinery. He said he was liable to accidents constantly. The machines never stopped for the children. The children had to work around the machines. At Quarrybank Mill, now a museum, records show that on the 6th of March, 1865, a 13-year-old boy named Joseph Foden was sweeping under a mule when his head was caught between the roller beam and the carriage. Death was instantaneous. The record describes it almost casually, as though this was simply something that happened. And it did happen, constantly. Research by Jane Humphreys at the University of Oxford revealed that one mill near Cork had such a poor safety record that 6 people died and 60 others were mutilated over just a 4-year period. Children lost fingers. They lost hands. Some lost their scalps when their hair caught in the machinery. The older scavengers around age 8 were promoted to become piecers. Their job was to lean over the spinning machines and repair broken threads while the machinery kept running. A Manchester factory owner named John Fielden once timed a child piecer at work. He calculated that the girl walked 20 miles during a single shift, 20 miles. A doctor named Samuel Smith, who practiced in Leeds, explained what this did to children's bodies. He said that standing for 12 or more hours caused their bones to bend. The arches of their feet collapsed. Their knees turned inward, producing a deformity called knock knees. He described children who had lost 12 inches of height from skeletal damage alone. One former child worker later recalled his life in heartbreaking detail. He said he was straight and healthy when he was 7. After working about half a year, a weakness fell into his knees and ankles. He could scarcely walk. His brother and sister used to take him under each arm and run with him to the mill, dragging his legs on the ground. If they were 5 minutes late, the overseer would beat them with a strap until they were black and blue. Lateness, mistakes, falling asleep, talking, even slowing down, all punished with beatings. The overseers carried leather straps specifically for this purpose. Some used wooden sticks. Others used iron rods. At a silk mill in Macclesfield, an 11-year-old girl named Sarah Stubbs worked as a piecer. She was beaten 58 times in a single day for failing to tie broken silk threads together quickly enough. She died from her injuries. 58 times. She was 11. The working hours were staggering by any standard. Children typically started at 5 or 6 in the morning and worked until 7 or 8 at night. Some shifts stretched to 16 hours. They were given 30 to 40 minutes for a midday meal. They often ate right there on the factory floor, their food covered in the same cotton dust and machine oil that covered everything else. There was nowhere else to go. There was no time to go there even if there had been. The normal work week ran Monday through Saturday, 6 days. Sunday was the only day off, and many children spent it sleeping. Their bodies were so utterly exhausted, they could do nothing else. These weren't teenagers. Many of them hadn't yet learned to read. Some hadn't yet lost all their baby teeth, and they were working longer hours than most adults work today. But the textile mills were only part of the story, because while the factories were crushing children's bodies, the coal mines were swallowing them whole. Britain's Industrial Revolution ran on coal. Every factory needed it. Every steam engine burned it. Every household fireplace consumed it. And getting it out of the ground required going deeper and further into narrow, dark, dangerous tunnels that adults often couldn't fit through. Children as young as 5 were sent underground. They worked the same 11 or 12-hour shifts as adults, sometimes longer, and the jobs they were given would be considered torture by modern standards. The youngest children became trappers. A trapper sat in a tiny alcove carved into the tunnel wall, holding a string attached to a ventilation door. When they heard coal wagons approaching, they pulled the door open. When the wagon passed, they closed it. That was their entire job, sitting alone, in total darkness, for 12 hours straight. At 5 years old, no one to talk to, nothing to see. Just the sound of your own breathing and the distant rumble of coal carts somewhere in the black. An 8-year-old girl named Sarah Gooder testified before a royal commission in 1842. She said she had to trap without a light, and she was scared. She went to work at 4 in the morning and came out at 5:30 in the evening. Sometimes she sang when she had light, but not in the dark. She didn't like being in the pit. When children grew strong enough, they graduated from trapping to hurrying. Hurriers were equipped with a leather belt called a girl, with a chain attached that ran between their legs and connected to a coal cart called a corf. They then crawled on their hands and knees through tunnels, sometimes only 16 inches high, dragging hundreds of pounds of coal behind them, mile after mile. Day after day, their skin rubbed raw against the rock floor beneath them. Patience Kershaw was 17 when she testified before Parliament. She had been hurrying since she was a small child. She described dragging corves weighing 300 weight for over a mile underground and back again. She had a bald patch on the top of her head, worn smooth from years of pushing the carts, with her scalp pressed against them. The youngest hurriers, called thrusters, pushed the coal carts from behind. They pushed with their heads. Day after day, year after year, their hair wore away completely on top. Some became permanently bald before they turned 10. The mines were wet. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling and pooled on the floors. Children spent their entire shifts in soaking wet clothes, in air thick with coal dust, in temperatures that ranged from freezing near the surface to stifling deep underground. The dust got into everything, their lungs, their eyes, their food. Children who worked the day shift saw sunlight only once a week. On Sundays, they entered the mine before dawn and emerged after dark. For 6 days out of every 7, their entire world was a narrow tunnel lit by a single candle stub. Many developed permanent eye problems from the constant strain of working in near darkness. The coal dust itself was a killer. Breathed in day after day, year after year, it filled children's lungs with fine black particles that could never be cleared. What we now call black lung disease was rampant among mine workers of all ages. But for children whose lungs were still developing, the damage was particularly devastating. Death, before the age of 25, was common for child miners. And then there were the explosions. Methane gas seeped naturally from coal seams. In poorly ventilated tunnels, it accumulated in invisible pockets. A single spark from a pickaxe hitting rock could ignite it. The resulting explosion would tear through the tunnels, killing everyone in its path, and collapsing passages that trapped survivors underground. In 1838, a disaster at Huskar Colliery near Barnsley killed 26 children in a single day. A stream overflowed into a ventilation shaft during a thunderstorm. 11 girls between 8 and 16 and 15 boys between 9 and 12 drowned underground. The disaster was reported to Queen Victoria herself. She ordered an investigation. Lord Ashley, who would later become the Earl of Shaftesbury, headed the Royal Commission. His investigators went into the mines and the mining communities, often against the wishes of mine owners who wanted no outsiders seeing what happened underground. What they found shocked Victorian society to its core. The 1842 report included illustrations based on what the investigators witnessed. Children crawling through tunnels on all fours. Girls and women working stripped to the waist alongside men and boys. Chains running between the legs of children as they dragged coal carts through passages barely wide enough to crawl through. The report led directly to the Mines Act of 1842, which banned all girls and women from working underground and set a minimum age of 10 for boys. But here is the thing. The act only applied to underground work, and enforcement was almost non-existent. 4 inspectors were appointed to oversee every mine in Britain, and the mines and factories weren't the only places consuming children's lives. Some of the worst suffering happened inside the chimneys of Britain's homes. Chimney sweeping in Victorian Britain was nothing like the cheerful image from Mary Poppins. Master sweeps purchased children from desperate parents or took them from workhouses. Some were as young as 3 years old. Their small size was the whole point. They needed to fit into chimney flues that were sometimes only 9 inches wide. Most chimneys twisted and forked as they rose through a building. An adult couldn't fit. A brush on a pole couldn't reach every corner, but a terrified child could. The children climbed naked, using their elbows and knees to wedge themselves up through the narrow passages. The first several times, the brickwork scraped their skin completely raw. Their elbows and knees bled freely. Their master would wash the wounds with salt water, then send them up the next chimney. After weeks of this torture, calluses formed over the wounds, making the climbing slightly less agonizing. But the dangers were only beginning. The walls of the chimneys were often still hot from recent fires. Children's skin blistered and burned. Some masters deliberately lit small fires beneath reluctant children to force them to climb faster. If a child got stuck, and many did in the twisting passages where flues merged, the results could be fatal. They suffocated in darkness, wedged between bricks, unable to move forward or back. Sometimes a second child was sent in to rescue the first, and both would perish. The coroner would record the death simply as accidental, 2 words. As though a child dying trapped inside a wall were no different from tripping on a stone. The constant exposure to soot caused devastating health problems. Respiratory diseases were universal. Eye infections were chronic, and many chimney sweeps developed a condition called chimney sweeps cancer, a form of scrotal cancer caused by soot particles embedding in their skin. There was no treatment. Most chimney sweeps didn't live to see middle age. In 1875, a 12-year-old boy named George Brewster was sent up a chimney at Fulburn Hospital by his master sweep. George died from the injuries he sustained. The public outcry that followed pushed Lord Shaftesbury to propose a new chimney sweepers act that finally required all sweeps to be licensed and supervised by police. But even that law took years to fully enforce. The last recorded case of a child being used as a climbing boy wasn't until the 1880s, decades after it had been made illegal, because the truth is, laws only matter when someone enforces them, and there were still more industries consuming children. At glassworks, boys as young as 8 worked in front of furnaces heated to over 2,000 degrees. Their job was to hold molten glass on the end of blowpipes, while experienced workers shaped it. Burns were constant. Blindness from the intense glare was common. The heat caused chronic dehydration that damaged their kidneys. In the potteries of Staffordshire, children worked with lead-based glazes that poisoned them slowly. They breathed in clay dust so fine it settled in their lungs like cement. The condition was called potter's rot. It destroyed their ability to breathe, and there was no cure. Most pottery workers didn't live past their 30s. In the fields, children as young as 6 worked as agricultural laborers. They scared birds from crops. They pulled weeds. They gathered stones. The work was seasonal but backbreaking, performed in all weather conditions from dawn until dusk. In 1841, agricultural laborer was the single most common occupation for boys under 20 in all of Britain, and then there were the match factories. In the 1850s and 60s, match production was one of the fastest growing industries in Britain, and most of the workers were girls, some as young as 6, who spent their days dipping wooden sticks into white phosphorus, a substance so toxic it would literally eat their bones. The girls worked up to 16 hours a day with almost no breaks. They ate at their workstations because they weren't allowed to leave. The phosphorus got into their food. It got into their water. It got into their bodies. And once it was inside them, it began destroying their jawbones from the inside out. The condition was called phossy jaw. It started with a toothache, then swelling, then abscesses. Then the bone itself began to rot. The jawbone turned green and glowed faintly in the dark from the phosphorus. The smell of decaying bone tissue was so powerful that other workers could barely stand to be near those affected. Employers rarely provided any protection, and they often dismissed girls once they became visibly ill, replaced them with fresh workers. The supply of desperate children never ran dry. The largest match manufacturer was Bryant and May in the East End of London. In 1888, the match girls at that factory did something that nobody expected. They went on strike. 1,400 girls and women walked out, marched to Parliament, and demanded better conditions. They won widespread public support and helped pave the way for modern labor unions. But here is where this story gets complicated. Because it is tempting to look back at Victorian child labor and see only villains and victims, cruel factory owners exploiting innocent children. But the reality was far more tangled than that. Many parents sent their children to work because the alternative was starvation. A factory worker's wages alone couldn't feed a family of 7 or 8 children. Every shilling a child earned meant another meal on the table. Parents didn't send their children into danger because they didn't love them. They did it because they saw no other choice. An 1832 report noted that parents roused their children in the morning and received them back tired and exhausted after the day had closed. They watched them droop and sicken, and in many cases become crippled and die before reaching their prime. And they did all this because they must otherwise starve. And not all factory owners were monsters. Robert Owen, who owned a cotton mill in New Lanark, Scotland, built an entire village for his workers. He provided schools, doctors, and proper housing. He refused to employ children under 10. He limited working hours, and his mill was still profitable. He proved it could be done differently, but Owen was the exception. Most factory owners saw children as cheap, expendable labor. A child earned roughly 1/8 what an adult earned for the same hours. Girls earned even less than boys, and children were easier to control, easier to intimidate, easier to replace when they were injured or worn out. The worst situation belonged to the pauper apprentices. These were orphans or abandoned children sold by workhouses to factory owners. The workhouse received a payment, and the factory owner received a child bound by contract until the age of 21. These children had no parents to advocate for them, no one waiting for them at home, no one to notice if they disappeared. They were, in every meaningful sense of the word, property. By 1800, there were an estimated 20,000 pauper apprentices working in cotton mills alone. They lived on the factory grounds in overcrowded dormitories. They were fed the minimum necessary to keep them working. If they tried to run away, they were caught, beaten, and returned. Some owners chained them to their machines to prevent escape. Those who ran successfully often ended up on the streets, trading one kind of misery for another. Robert Blincoe was one of these children, sent from a London workhouse to a cotton mill in Derbyshire as a young boy. He later published a memoir describing what he endured. He wrote about being terrified by the noise and motion of the machinery, about being half suffocated by cotton dust, about being beaten when he tried to sit down because his back ached. On one occasion, Blincoe was nearly crushed by a mule. Despite his head injuries, his overseer beat him for not completing the sweep in a single pass. Blincoe survived. He eventually founded his own cotton spinning business. But his memoir, published in 1832, helped expose the reality of what was happening to children behind factory walls. And it was testimony like Blincoe's that began to change things. In 1832, a member of Parliament named Michael Sadler secured permission to investigate conditions in textile factories. His committee interviewed 89 witnesses over 3 months. The stories they heard were devastating. Elizabeth Bentley testified that she began work in a flax mill at 6 years old. She was asked what time she had allowed for meals. 40 minutes at noon, she answered. She was asked what happened if workers slowed down. They were strapped. Were they strapped severely? Yes, constantly. Sadler's report was published in early 1833. Its contents shocked the British public, but Sadler himself had already lost his parliamentary seat, defeated in an election by John Marshall, a major factory owner. The irony was bitter. The man who exposed the suffering of factory children was removed from office by a man who profited from it. Lord Ashley picked up where Sadler left off. The Factory Act of 1833 was the result. It banned children under 9 from textile factories. It limited children aged 9 to 13 to 8 hours a day. It required 2 hours of education daily, and for the first time it appointed paid inspectors to enforce the rules. 4 inspectors for the entire country. 4 people tasked with monitoring every textile factory in Britain. Factory owners knew the odds of being caught were vanishingly small. Many simply ignored the law entirely. When inspectors did appear, owners hid underage workers or produced fake age certificates. It wasn't until 1836 that the registration of births, deaths, and marriages gave inspectors a way to verify children's ages. Before that, there were no birth certificates. A factory owner could claim any child was 9 years old, and there was no way to prove otherwise. And the reforms kept coming, painfully slowly. The 1844 Factory Act classified women as young persons and limited both groups to 12 hours on weekdays. The 10 Hours Act of 1847 reduced it further to 10 hours for women and children under 18. Each step forward was fought bitterly by factory owners who argued it would destroy British industry. It didn't. Robert Owen had already proved that humane working conditions were compatible with profit. But the owners had powerful allies in Parliament. Progress was measured in decades, not years. Every reform was watered down, delayed, or poorly enforced. Children continued to suffer long after laws existed to protect them. There is a German visitor to Manchester in 1842 who left behind an observation that captures the human cost better than any statistics. He remarked that there were so many limbless people walking the streets. It was like living in the midst of an army just returned from a campaign. A doctor who examined mill workers described their complexion as sallow and pallid. He noted a peculiar flatness of feature caused by malnourishment. Their stature was low. Nearly all had bowed legs. Flat feet were universal. The average height of the working population actually decreased during the 1830s as an entire generation of overworked children reached adulthood with permanent skeletal damage. Think about that. An entire generation of children literally stunted by labor, shorter, weaker, and more deformed than their grandparents had been. The Industrial Revolution didn't just exploit children, it physically reshaped them, and the psychological damage is something we can only guess at. Victorian children didn't have the language for what we'd now call trauma. They didn't have therapists or counselors. They had exhaustion and violence and darkness and noise. Day after day, year after year, from the time they could walk, the female overseers at some mills would cut the hair off any girl caught talking to the boys. The children said they feared this more than any other punishment, because girls are proud of their hair. In the midst of grinding physical hardship, they were still children, still caring about things children care about. If you are still listening, maybe drifting off a little, that is perfectly fine. But hold on to this for a moment longer. The question that haunts this entire story isn't really about the past. It is about how an entire society could watch children being broken and accept it as normal. How could millions of adults walk past factories every day, hear the machinery, see the children going in before dawn and coming out after dark, and simply go on with their lives? The answer is more complicated than simple cruelty. Because child labor didn't begin with the Industrial Revolution. It had existed for centuries in agriculture, in craft workshops, in domestic service. What the factories did was concentrate it, make it visible, and make it vastly more dangerous by putting small children next to large machines. Part of the answer is that they genuinely believed they were helping. Child labor wasn't seen as abuse. It was seen as discipline, as moral education, as protection against the greater evil of idleness. The theological and economic arguments aligned perfectly. Work built character. Idle hands were the devil's workshop, and families needed the income. Part of the answer is that poverty makes everything invisible. When you are struggling to feed your own family, you don't have the luxury of worrying about someone else's children. The working poor of Victorian Britain were too exhausted, too hungry, and too desperate to organize against a system that was crushing them alongside their children. And part of the answer is that change requires someone to see what everyone else has learned not to. Michael Sadler saw it. Lord Shaftesbury saw it. Charles Dickens saw it and turned it into stories that made the comfortable middle classes finally pay attention. Charles Kingsley saw it and wrote The Water Babies, a novel about a chimney sweep boy that made Victorian parents weep. The Match Girls saw it and did something about it themselves. 1,400 of them, most teenagers, many as young as 13, stood up and said no more. And the world listened. By 1870, compulsory elementary education was introduced for children between 5 and 13. This single law did more to end child labor than all the factory acts combined, because once children had to be in school, they couldn't be in the factories. The education system slowly pried children away from the machines. It gave them hours in the day that belonged to something other than labor. It gave them a future that wasn't measured in coal dust and cotton thread. By 1901, the minimum working age had been raised to 12. By the end of World War I, full-time work for anyone under 16 was prohibited. It had taken nearly a century of campaigning, from the first ineffective act in 1802 to meaningful enforcement in the early 20th century. A century, that is how long it took for a society to decide that children deserved childhoods. And even then, the resistance was fierce. Factory owners argued that limiting child labor would make British goods too expensive to compete internationally. They argued that children were better off in factories than on the streets. They argued that parents had the right to decide how their children earned a living. These arguments didn't go away easily. Some of those arguments still echo today in parts of the world where children work in garment factories, mines, and farms, under conditions that would have been familiar to a Victorian child piecer. The International Labour Organization estimates that roughly 160 million children worldwide are still engaged in child labor, 79 million of them in hazardous work, and there were millions of Victorian children who didn't even have a factory job to go to. The street children of London and other cities survived on whatever scraps they could find. Crossing sweepers who cleared horse dung from street crossings for a penny, flower sellers, shoeblacks, newsboys, mudlarks who scavenged in the Thames riverbed at low tide, searching for anything they could sell. At mid-century, there were over 120,000 domestic servants in London alone. Many were girls as young as 12 who worked 80-hour weeks for half a penny per H-hour. They cleaned, they cooked, they cared for wealthy families' children while their own childhoods disappeared behind kitchen doors and scullery walls. In 1840, only about 20% of London's children had any schooling at all. By 1860, that number had risen to roughly half. But for the other half, life remained what it had always been: work, sleep, and more work. Day after day until you were too broken to continue. The story of Victorian child labor isn't really a story about the past. It is a story about what happens when an economic system treats human beings as raw material. When profit is measured in tonnage and output, instead of in broken bodies and shortened lives. When the smallest and most vulnerable are fed into the machine because they fit between the gears. Elizabeth Bentley, Sarah Gooder, Patience Kershaw, Robert Blinke, Joseph Foden, Sarah Stubbs, George Brewster. These are some of the names that survived. Most didn't leave names at all. Most were recorded only as numbers in a factory ledger, if they were recorded at all. A tally mark representing a life that started in a workhouse and ended beneath a spinning mule or inside a chimney flue. Numbers that added up to profit for someone else, but they were children. Every one of them, children who were scared in the dark, children who were proud of their hair, children who sang when they had light, children who ached and bled and kept going because they had no choice, children who deserved better than what the richest empire on earth gave them. Their story deserves to be remembered, not with anger, but with the kind of quiet resolve that turns knowledge into change. If you are still with us, thank you. If you've drifted off, that is exactly what you are supposed to do. These stories have waited 2 centuries. They'll keep until morning. Next time you look at your hands, remember, those hands were never designed for 14-hour shifts in darkness. They were designed for something far more extraordinary, for holding books, for reaching out to someone who needs help, for building a world where no child has to crawl beneath a machine just to survive. And that world exists now, not perfectly, not everywhere, but it exists because people looked at what was happening and refused to look away. Subscribe and stick around, and sleep well tonight.